After 2 years of war in Ukraine, 2024 is before us. Manpower and quantity advantage has often helped decide wars, like in 2 world wars, and has even brought Ukraine its biggest victories in 2022. Russia is slowly raising its troops and will likely reach 700,000 by this summer. Ukraine's army has been vocal about needing another 500,000 troops, but there are issues making that a hard sell. Russia may well go through another round of reservist mobilization if Ukraine goes through with its mobilization. So this video will cover possible future manpower issues for 2024 for both sides. Who has how many soldiers now, and how might those numbers rise through the year? Watch the video to find out more. The war back in 2022 started with a fairly small Russian invasion force. Not all near-border Russian forces entered Ukraine at once. When one includes the Donbas region and Crimea troops, there were roughly 150,000 Russian troops involved at the very start. Ukraine's forces grew at a breakneck pace in those early months of the war as more and more people volunteered. Even though Russians added more troops, by late summer their forces were outnumbered, more than 3 to 1. Late summer and early fall of 2022 is when Ukraine put that troop number advantage to use, attacking overstretched Russian lines and liberating big chunks of territory near Kharkiv and Kherson. So troop numbers clearly matter. Back then Russia was holding quite a long front line, and it simply could not populate it with enough soldiers. But troop number ratios have changed since then. Ukraine managed to get to 1 million troops, as per its defense officials, by the end of 2022. That figure included National Guard and Border Guard troops, meaning rearguard troops and not just official military troops. Without those, the military had numbered 800,000. Russia, on the other hand, hid behind that shorter front line in the east of Ukraine and behind the river Dnieper in the west, and further boosted its manpower figures. The famous 300,000 mobilized troops also helped. Sometime in early 2023, as those mobilized troops got trained, Russia likely hit 500,000 troops inside Ukraine and its occupied territories, while Ukraine more or less stayed at 1 million troops. It's not easy to add more troops as casualties mount. Plus, even if one disregards casualties, it's usually prudent to rotate troops, letting some rest, and even demobilize some after years of war, as morale in long-term deployments tends to suffer. Both sides were continuously adding troops to simply cover the losses. That may explain why Ukraine's figures didn't budge over 1 million for so long. September 2023 was the last time Ukraine's Minister of Defense said Ukraine had 1 million troops under its belt. 2 months later, Budanov, Ukraine's military intelligence chief, said Ukraine had 1.1 million. Subtracting the rearguard formations, January count of official military formations went up to 850,000. Casualties can only be guesstimated from various sources. In November 2022, US General Mark Milley said Ukraine was at over 100,000 wounded and dead. That was after the first 9 months of the war. In August 2023, another US defense official claimed 70,000 killed and 110,000 wounded Ukrainians. That's 80,000 more in the following 9 months. So by now, this January, given that Ukraine has been more on the defensive and thus potentially losing fewer troops per month, the overall tally might be some 210 to 220,000 wounded and dead. What that means is that Ukraine didn't mobilize just 1.1 million troops by now, but it mobilized closer to 1.3 million. Some of the wounded do return to service, but given the fairly small number of wounded estimated, the returned figures aren't likely going to be much over 50,000 or so. Russia has lost even more troops, of course. Various Western sources differ on the exact figure, but they all suggest a little over 300,000 wounded and dead by December, of which killed troop estimates do have a wider range. Given all those, it's plausible the current January average estimate may be 105 to 110,000 Russians killed, with another 200 to 250,000 wounded. In mid-December, Putin said there were 617,000 Russian troops fighting in Ukraine. That's likely not just boasting, as just a bit earlier Ukraine's intelligence estimated there were 600,000 Russians inside Ukraine. So the situation now is this. The 3.2 times more troops advantage that Ukraine enjoyed at one point when it managed those successful offensive in 2022 shrunk to a 1.8 times more troops. And possibly worse if the Russian figure doesn't, for example, include rearguard troops near Ukraine's borders. If pure military troops are considered, the ratio advantage might be just 1.4 times more troops for Ukraine. Of course, 2024 has just begun. Ukraine did not stop recruiting troops, and in late December, word came of possible another big round of mobilization. The Ukrainian army said it needs another 500,000 troops. Ukraine's government must now see how they might go about declaring such a big round of mobilization. But the parliament has since been locked in arguments, and allegedly decisions on the mobilization front may be unlikely in the near future. One has to keep in mind that most troops on both sides do not get to enjoy downtime. Some have called for those 500,000 fresh troops to at least partially replace the tired troops. Also, casualties are always mounting, so by the time 500,000 new troops get assembled and trained, it's plausible another 100,000 of the current troops will not be there anymore. To sum it up, it's likely that the 500,000 more troops called for will result in a total figure of under 1.5 million come summer or so, possibly 1.4 million if some troop rotation is done. That's a very serious figure. Russia, while increasing its troop numbers, is not likely to match it in 2024. After adding those 320,000 reservists in late 2022, Russia kept spending money to entice people to join the military. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, some 400,000 joined the army from January to December 2023. Some of those will of course cover for soldiers whose contracts have run out. A few will go serve elsewhere in Russia. End-year goal for 2023 was to have 521,000 contract troops. That might suggest that some 100 or so thousand troops were left from previous year contracts. Possibly 100 to 200,000 finish their contracts each year, and of course 100,000 or more are likely to get seriously wounded or die over the course of 2024. Basically, during the 2 years of this war, Russia may have added 1 million fresh troops, while subtracting little over 500,000, when casualties and retirements are included. Of course, not all new contract troops will go into Ukraine, though most likely will. Given that Russia walked into Ukraine with some 200,000 troops, Donbass included, it might enter summer of 2024 with around 700,000 troops inside Ukraine. That's once the new contract troops get trained and plausible future casualties are subtracted. Summer is usually the best period of the year for large offensives, with both Russia and Ukraine trying those in 2022 and Ukraine trying it again in 2023. If Ukraine does go through with mobilizing 500,000 more troops, which sort of seems likely given the course of the war and Russian troop figures slowly creeping up, the troop advantage Ukraine will enjoy may be between 1.6 and 2 times more soldiers, depending on context. Of course, there might be a morale problem. 500,000 mobilized refers to those getting summons, so they may not be very willing to fight. That's not to say Russian contract troops are willing. They might be there mostly for the money, but the big advantage in morale that Ukraine once had at the start of the war has already shrunk, and by summer of 2024, if there are no new successes for Ukraine, the advantage might shrink even more. These are highly unquantifiable categories, of course, but long-term multi-year wars tend to wear everyone out, even the side who's fighting for their own survival. While some morale advantage is still plausible for Ukraine, it may be small during 2024. Another big unknown is whether Russia will attempt another round of its mobilization of reservists. Those two would be unwilling and would lower the average morale even further for Russia. But on the flip side, if Russia adds another 300,000 troops and gives them basic training lasting a few months, it might get to 1 million troops in Ukraine, compared to 1.4 million or so Ukrainians. That would be the smallest troop advantage Ukraine had in this war, if it comes to that. Some Ukrainian officials have said they expect Putin might order such mobilization as soon as the March elections in Russia are over. If a mobilization does happen, Russia might have those additional troops trained by July. Of course, mobilization is a risky political move. If it wasn't, Putin would have mobilized 1 million men already. But Putin may fear mass protests and perhaps even a revolution. He seems pretty set at not rocking the boat too much politically. For 2024, there is little worry that either side will run out of troops. Looking at the UN numbers for Ukraine's population pyramid, Ukraine today should have something like 15 to 16 million males. That's after the population lost in Russian-held areas and population fleeing is accounted for. According to UN estimates, Ukraine had some 3.2 million males under the age of 18 at the end of 2022. As long as morale can be kept up and people pressured into service, the theoretical pool of people is there. During World War II, Soviets and Germans had 12 to 21% of their males serving in the army per year during the peak years. So something like 2 to 3 million Ukrainian males serving in the army might be theoretically attainable. That's not to say it will happen, as today's economies have different needs and people today aren't as easily persuaded to go to war as they were in world wars. But the year 2024 seems set to yield enough troops for Ukraine. That's not to say Ukraine doesn't have issues with manpower. There were multiple statements from Ukrainian officials about manpower woes. We covered those in our previous videos. But what it boils down to is that Ukraine can't count on volunteers so much. It now has to order people to serve, just like World War II armies had to resort to. On paper, Russia now has roughly 5 times bigger population to draw forces from, when occupied areas are included. But Russia might have much bigger problems politically if it goes about forcing additional people to serve. That's why Putin has so far been relying largely on money and influx of young people, where Russia keeps buying new soldiers throughout the year, so to say. Average monthly salary in Russia in 2023 was just $760, but new contract soldiers got 3 times as much, $2,200, as the starting salary. That's without bonuses, which allegedly go for $100 per day of participation in an offensive. So it's no wonder that many of the poorer Russians see a stint in the army as an acceptable risk to get their families out of poverty, even if it means there's a chance they might die. Given the Russian fossil fuel-filled pockets, upkeeping a 1.3 million army which Putin announced in late 2023 may be doable for a few more years to come. Even though fossil fuel income has been hit, percentage-wise, it's still high. And Russia keeps a rainy day fund, Russian National Wealth Fund, which can cover the deficit for several more years to come. Ukraine is in a much worse state financially. While the Russian deficit represents 2% of their GDP, Ukrainian is 19% of theirs. Without constant influx of European and US money, Ukraine would not be able to hold out, which is why it's crucial for Ukraine that the money keeps flowing. But now we're getting into financial aid and away from the pure manpower issue. Sufficient manpower is crucial for Ukraine if it wants to be able to keep trying new offensives to regain territory, as attacking usually requires numerical superiority, especially if the army has no superiority in other areas. And Russia still has an edge in equipment, and it largely controls the skies over the front line. If Ukraine wants to give another big offensive a try this year, it would likely need both those 500,000 more troops mobilized and another big and quick round of US and Europe's equipment injection. Also, if Russia reactivates the long borders up north or even strikes from Belarus again, Ukraine would again need a lot of manpower to man all those miles of the front. Manpower isn't everything, of course. Finances, intelligence, supplies, weapons and other equipment can make or break an army. But quantity and manpower did often decide wars, which is why we dealt with that in this video. For other aspects of the war that the year 2024 may bring us, do keep an eye for some other video of ours.